everyone, and welcome to another episode of Zaneza, a space where we go beyond official narratives and glossy headlines to examine what is really happening in Rwanda. I am your host, Denise Zaneza, and as always, it is an honor to guide you through these vital and often uncomfortable conversations. In today's episode, we confront one of the most serious accusations that can be made under international law, the accusation of aggression. In a recent article published in the Harvard International Law Journal, Daniel Levine-Spound argues that Rwanda's military involvement in Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo amounts not merely to regional instability and not simply to proxy conflict, but to a manifest violation of the United Nations Charter. To help us unpack this, I am honored to be joined today by Daniel Levine-Spound, a human rights lawyer, a researcher, and a lecturer at Harvard Law School, who will guide us through the legal definition of aggression, the limits of international justice, and the concrete avenues that remain for accountability. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Welcome. Before we dive deep into our conversation, would you please introduce yourself in your own words to our audience, please?
Sure. Again, I'm really happy to be joining you all. So my name is Daniel Levine-Spound. As you mentioned, I'm a human rights lawyer. I currently teach at the International Human Rights Clinic at Harvard Law School. And prior to working at Harvard, I lived and worked in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, first in Kinshasa and then in Goma between 2019 and 2022. And my work generally focuses on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. So looking at accountability often for violations of international law, including international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, international human rights law, and international criminal law. And I'm very, very, very focused on accountability efforts related to Rwanda's illegal use of force in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo and its devastating consequences for civilians.
Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you. And in your article, Rwanda's aggression in Eastern DRC, Avenues for Accountability, it is called, was recently published, and at this very critical time when many are seeking legal avenues to hold responsible actors accountable. First of all, what made you decide to research and write about this topic right now? And is there a particular development or a legal gap or policy failure that motivated you to write this article?
First of all, I think I would say that it comes from a very personal place. So I loved living in Goma. I have many friends from Eastern DRC, many of whom are artists or human rights defenders, and I've seen their lives entirely upended by Rwanda's invasion. Most of the people I know who were in Goma, who are from Goma, are no longer there. Those who are, their lives have been radically transformed in overwhelmingly negative ways. So I also wrote this out of a sense of anger. I had been working on issues related to Rwanda's illegal use of force since 2021, 2022. But I really started writing quickly in January, or I should say in January 2025, I think it was, when Goma fell to Rwandan forces, and then Bukavu a few weeks later. And I think one thing that I really wanted to explain to readers is that I think when it comes to conflict in Eastern DRC, and I think honestly this applies to conflicts in Africa more broadly, Western audiences tend to not approach it with a level of nuance and sophistication that they would if this was a conflict in Europe or the Middle East or somewhere else. So when we talk about conflicts in other parts of the world, often we'll talk about an aggressor state, a victim state, etc. What I noticed is that in the rhetoric around the ongoing Eastern DRC Rwanda conflict was that people tended to talk about something as very, very messy. So either something that couldn't understand because there are just too many actors and too many armed groups, or very, very reductive. This is just about a chase for minerals. And I feel like that's often how people in the US at least will talk about conflicts in Africa, either as it's too complicated, you can't understand it, or it's really, really simple, it's just about X. And what I wanted to do here is sort of explain that the underlying legal dynamics here are not altogether different from the conflict, for instance, in Russia and Ukraine, in which we have one state that invaded another state. So part of what I wanted to do here is explain that, yes, there are violations by all sides. There are complicated legal questions, but fundamentally, we are looking at a cycle of violence that began, at least in the most recent iteration, when Rwanda illegally invaded Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. That is a core violation of the international legal order, much like Russia's illegal use of force in Ukraine. And that is the sort of beginning of the spirals of violence that we're seeing. So my point wasn't to say Rwanda is uniquely at fault and no one else is at fault, but to say, much like, again, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, that this is not some messy, incomprehensible, lots of armed groups, lots of states, you can't understand it. No, this is an instance in which one state invaded another state, clearly with the purpose of annexing, whether, in fact or in law, one part of the territory of another state, and that's illegal.
It's true. It's true. And indeed, thank you for explaining that. And Rwanda's actions in Eastern DRC constitutes acts of crimes of aggression. And in your own words, could you explain in accessible terms for everyone what these acts and crimes are, particularly how they align with the elements of the crime of aggression under international law?
Fantastic. So I think maybe just to start on the background level. So if we look at international crimes, so to start, I think it's worth looking at the Rome Statute, which is the foundational treaty of the International Criminal Court, and also a comprehensive statement of international criminal law as it exists. And the Rome Statute recognizes four broad classes of crimes: war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and aggression. And aggression is quite different from the other crimes because it concerns an illegal use of force, right? So a comparison with war crimes, I think, is instructive. When we're looking at war crimes, we're not looking at whether one state illegally invaded another or whether one state had the right to respond in self-defense. We're looking at the law governing armed conflict. So we're saying, did you violate the law of armed conflict in a way that's so egregious that you could be criminally responsible, right? For aggression, we're looking at illegal actions of states generally against other states, right? So in the legal framework that we live in, following the 1945 and the coming into force of the UN Charter, states are generally prohibited from using force against other states, except in self-defense or with the authorization of the UN Security Council. Aggression at the most basic level is an illegal use of force by one state against another state, which is so egregious that it can give rise to individual criminal responsibility. So we talk about acts of aggression and crimes of aggression. An illegal use of force, an illegal use of force that rises to a certain gravity, we would call an act of aggression. And then a crime of aggression is, at the most basic level, the ordering or facilitating of the act of aggression by a leader. And aggression, to be clear, under the Rome Statute, is a leadership crime, right? So generally, we don't think about low-level soldiers being prosecuted for aggression. We think about high-level political or military leaders being prosecuted for aggression.
Yes, that is very clear indeed. For the crimes of aggression is met with Rwanda aggressing DRC.
Right.
My question is, could Rwandan officials, so since we just made the basis that they are the ones who are responsible for aggression, could they realistically be prosecuted before International Criminal Court? And procedurally speaking, how would such a case even begin?
Yeah.
Because who has the authority at the end of the day to trigger ICC jurisdiction, and
Yeah.
what practical barriers could stand in the way?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, well, first to maybe say, because I mentioned before what the crime of aggression and what acts of aggression are, but
Mhm.
maybe just to say that if you look at the Rome Statute, and I've just pulled it up here, if you
Thank
look at
you.
Article 8, Beast 2, um,
Mhm.
you can see a list of state acts which can qualify as acts of aggression. So, including the invasion or attack by the armed forces of a state against another state, the bombardment of the armed forces of one state against the territory of another state, an attack by the armed forces of one state against the armed forces of another state. So again, what we have in the Rwanda DRC context, and I think it's important for listeners to understand, is
Mhm.
that Rwanda began illegally using force against Eastern DRC. And it began using illegal force in many of the ways envisioned by the Rome Statute, right? It invaded Eastern DRC. It started attacking the armed forces of Eastern DRC, the FARDC. It started bombarding parts of Eastern DRC. So there are many unilateral acts committed by Rwandan forces which could qualify as acts of aggression. Additionally, we have the M23 element. So, for listeners who are less familiar, Rwanda has, in my view, committed acts of aggression both unilaterally, right, through its own troops in Eastern DRC, but also by proxy, right, given the level of control that it exercises over Eastern DRC. And there are particular, acts of aggression, again, imagined by the Rome Statute. You can look, it's Article 8, Beast 2G, which imagines the sending on behalf of a state of armed groups into the territory of another state. We could get really far into some of the legal details here. We won't. But just to say, I think broadly listeners should understand that Rwanda's aggression has taken multiple forms, both unilateral forms, the acts of Rwandan troops, but also the way that Rwanda
Proxy.
has acted through M23. Right. And I think that's really important to understand because most of the violations or most of the actions that are taking place in Eastern DRC right now that look like aggression are committed by M23 forces. Right. The level of Rwandan military presence in Eastern DRC goes up and down. Whereas we have a huge numbers, thousands of M23 combatants. And it's really important to understand the links between Rwanda and M23 because the argument of the Rwandan government has been essentially this is a problem between Congolese, right? President
It's
Paul
not
Kagame
completely.
says that himself, right? These are Congolese people fighting among themselves. What I think we need to understand is that no, this is Rwanda acting by proxy. However, and I think this is really important, whether or not a court eventually decided that Rwanda had effective control over M23, we still have many unilateral acts by Rwanda that would qualify
Yes.
as acts of aggression. Right? Rwandan troops themselves, not just M23, RDF troops themselves have been involved in major military operations across Eastern DRC, including the takeover of major cities. So I think that is really, really important. And I think just to go a little bit deeper, Rwanda has denied this. My guess would be that if Rwanda ever acknowledged, and it has sort of obliquely, it's often the rhetoric, as you know better than me, is one of self-defense, right? So the argument is essentially, well, we are defending ourselves from FDLR, right? Which I imagine your listeners mostly know, but FDLR is an armed group that has existed in Eastern DRC since the mid 90s. Initially formed by génocidaires who fled after the end of the genocide in 1994. And it's true that at present, there's a lot of evidence that the Congolese military works with the FDLR. I think the problem for Rwanda is that they've gotten the chronology wrong. Right. So FDLR did exist prior to Rwanda's use of force in Eastern DRC, but there's absolutely no evidence that the main motivating factor for Rwanda's invasion was FDLR. We don't have evidence of FDLR planning any attacks against Rwanda. Evidence points to the fact that most of their activities were focused in Congo itself, including economic activities. But since the invasion, right, the Congolese government, which has been on the back foot, has partnered with all sorts of armed groups, including FDLR. So in some ways, it's as if Rwanda has created the justification for its own invasion by invading, right? You attack a country. When the country you attack starts working with an armed group that you don't like, you say, aha, aha, well, we have no choice but to attack this country because they're working with this armed group we don't like, right? So Rwanda fundamentally gets the chronology wrong, right? You, in some ways, have created the pretext for your attack. Another thing the Rwandan government might argue, right, is that it is defending certain populations in Eastern DRC, particularly Kinyarwanda-speaking communities, particularly Tutsi communities in North Kivu and South Kivu. Again, the problem is that they get the chronology wrong, right? Because the more Rwanda attacks, the more they sort of fan the flames of anti-Rwanda, anti-Tutsi hatred in Eastern DRC. Right. So you're saying that you are, attacking in order to protect this community, but you're actually endangering this community. And I think one thing we have to ask is when Rwanda's invasion and occupation ultimately ends, and I believe it will ultimately end, what will the situation be for those, who are suspected of working with the rebellion? It's something I really worry about. So I think
Yes,
Rwanda's argument that it is protecting certain communities in Eastern DRC really doesn't make sense. Not because there isn't, prejudice against Banyarwanda, Kinyarwanda speakers, or against Tutsi in particular in Eastern DRC. I think it's obvious that there is, at least in some areas. The question is Rwanda's attack really meant to protect those communities?
no,
I
not
don't think
at
it
all.
is.
Not at all, because also there's a group recently that came out and expressed from the Banyamulenge community
Yeah.
that we have nothing to do with Rwanda and
Yeah.
we don't know why they invade Congo and pretend that they are here to protect us. We are not affiliated with them. We don't want anything to do with them.
Yeah.
So it's clear that this has been an excuse,
Yeah.
another excuse, such as the excuse of the FDLR to
Yeah.
invade Congo. And
Mhm.
also when we look at the areas where they have captured
Yeah.
territories, they are very rich in critical minerals.
Yeah.
So where are those FDRs? Where are those
Right.
Tutsis that they are trying to protect? Nowhere to be seen.
Nowhere.
So
Right. Right. If they were only focused on areas that had historically had a meaningful FDLR presence, that would be one thing. But,
it's not the
they've moved
case.
so far beyond that, right? So it's not as if they're mostly in areas that are, majority Hutu areas, for instance. Um, and they've moved, and at a certain point they've moved so far beyond their borders, right? I mean, at certain points they've been deep in Walikale, for instance. So if they were just focused on the areas right near the borders, I'm not saying their actions would be legal, but it might be more credible that, okay, you're
It's not
really
the case.
focused
Yes.
on like FDLR, you're really focused on issues that mostly concern Banyarwanda communities in Eastern DRC. And but that's not true. And to your other point, which I think is so important, is I think we have a long history of Rwanda instrumentalizing Kinyarwanda speaking communities in Congo and essentially trying to speak for those communities. And as you pointed out, we've seen, different Munyamulenge leaders and also, other Munyarwanda from other parts of Eastern DRC saying, look, I'm not President Kagame. I didn't order this. I think some human rights researchers have talked to Tutsis from North Kivu who said, since the invasion, I had to flee my town
Mhm.
because everyone suspected me of working with the rebellion. So we do need reconciliation in Eastern DRC, but this is not the way to do it. Prosecuting for aggression is really, really hard. And that's partially because the Rome Statute of the ICC, so as I mentioned before, it has four types of crimes.
Yes.
war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and aggression. And the jurisdiction over the court over the first three is different than the court's jurisdiction over aggression. Um, so right now the ICC has an investigation in Eastern DRC. So theoretically, we could see prosecutions for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And to be clear, it's not limited to Rwanda, right? I mean, these arrest warrants could go out against people from from other armed groups, for instance. But for aggression, the court's jurisdiction is extremely limited. I'll avoid some of the complicated debates, but at the most basic level, the ICC can't prosecute aggression in instances in which one of the states is not a state party to the Rome Statute.
Mm-hmm.
So in this instance, DRC has ratified the Rome Statute, Rwanda hasn't. So that means that the court has jurisdiction, territorial jurisdiction, it's called, in the area of Eastern DRC, including crimes committed by non-Congolese nationals. But because Rwanda is not a state party to the Rome Statute, the court could not prosecute aggression by Rwandan leaders against Eastern DRC. This has gotten a lot of attention recently because of the Russia-Ukraine context, right? The ICC has issued arrest warrants against high-level Russian officials for war crimes and crimes against humanity, but not aggression because we have the same problem, right? Russia and Rwanda are not states, have not accepted the jurisdiction of the court. Right. So there are a bunch of efforts underway to try to fix this. One is, changing the Rome Statute, and a number of states tried to do this last summer. They didn't succeed. They'll try again in a few years. I really hope that they do. I think it's really, really important because I think theoretically the ICC should be able to prosecute aggression everywhere. Another question is, some sort of independent tribunal, right? So we have a new tribunal that exists in the Russia-Ukraine context, or is in the process of being built. I haven't been following it so closely. The process of being implemented. Theoretically, many Congolese civil society leaders have called for some kind of tribunal looking at accountability for crimes in Eastern DRC, not just by the Rwandan government or M23. So we could imagine an international court like that that had jurisdiction over the crime of aggression, depending on the nature of the court. Theoretically, we could also have a UN Security Council referral. I think that's pretty unlikely, but I guess not impossible, right? Not impossible. But I think, one thing that's really important is that even if we don't have a criminal prosecution for aggression, increased recognition that what Rwanda is doing is aggression ought to lead to more consequences, including political consequences, right? I would love to see more states and the UN taking stronger action against Rwanda. For me personally, and I'm not Congolese or Rwandan, so my opinion on this doesn't really matter. But my interest in writing this article was not so much in the hopes of someone going to prison, but was more in an effort to try to put pressure on the Rwandan government. To have the Rwandan government essentially recognize, oh, maybe it's not worth it to keep attacking Eastern DRC because of the risks.
Yes, indeed. And you also mentioned and you outlined multiple avenues for accountability beyond criminal prosecution, that they can also be other legal mechanisms, like you just said, and political pressure, economic measures, and diplomatic tools. And for our audience, recently, just a small reminder, the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control designated the Rwandan Defense Force and several senior Rwandan military officials for blatant violations of peace accords related to the Eastern DRC conflict. And this is, for me, in short term, very effective as sanctions to effectively push Rwanda to stop the aggression and withdraw the Rwandan troops from DRC. But of course, on a longer run, much needs to be done so that there comes a complete end to this aggression and to the human rights violations that have been going on. This has been going on for 30 years. This is a lot of time. This is many years, and people have suffered enough. And I think the world must wake up and decide that it's time to end this conflict and bring peace back to DRC.
And I think you make a really good point. I mean, I think, it's interesting. So, 10, 12 years ago, there's that friend, plus ça change, plus ça reste la même chose. There's this dynamic here where Rwanda invades Eastern DRC, either unilaterally or through proxy forces, right? This is something that happens. And in 2012, 2013, the same story happened. Some differences, but the M23 again took over, for instance, the city of Goma. It looked like M23's territorial control was expanding rapidly. And ultimately, it's important to note that Rwanda stopped supporting M23 in the face of international pressure. And people dispute what exactly the most important factors were, but it's clear that, lots, very, very, very significant millions of dollars in financial aid and assistance was frozen, that was destined for Rwanda was frozen. We had political leaders calling Rwandan political leaders, so President Barack Obama called President Paul Kagame himself. We obviously had a deployment of troops from across, particularly southern Africa, deployed in eastern DRC in support of the Congolese military, as part of the UN peacekeeping mission, but part with a more offensive mandate. So we had a number of factors that I think essentially pushed the Rwandan government to give it up. And when the Rwandan government stopped supporting M23, M23 collapsed fairly quickly. 12 years later, the situation is quite different because Rwanda's political positioning, I think, is very different. The Rwandan government has a lot of friends. And particularly, Rwanda is a major police and troop contributing country to the UN. Rwanda has built close relationships with a number of European Union states. Rwanda has a military deployment in Mozambique in areas that are politically very important, particularly for France. Yes. Rwanda has a number of close partnerships with different states across the African Union. So Rwanda has sort of tried the same thing, but in a much stronger diplomatic position. And I think, despite some sanctions and the recent sanctions are obviously much more significant, but Rwanda for a number of years, 4 years or so, was able to escape major diplomatic and financial consequences. And I think that needs to end. Right. I think that needs to end. I think ultimately we need to see major diplomatic and political pressure. I'd rather it not just come in the form of one state's unilateral action, although I don't disagree with that, but I'd rather it come in the form of something more global and collective, perhaps both at the African Union level and at the European Union level. But I ultimately think that we'll see the effects of these sanctions. I don't want to comment too much given that it's still early. But I reject the notion that Rwanda has essentially annexed North and South Kivu and that its occupation will last forever. I still think that there are things that the international community can do. And the other thing is I just really want to say a word about the courage of human rights defenders, including Rwandan human rights defenders, right? Rwandan human rights defenders and Congolese human rights defenders who are standing up to injustice in the Great Lakes region. It's their courage that continues to inspire, foreigners like me to continue to write and research. But, and you know this far better than me, but that there are still a lot of human rights defenders in Rwanda who are pushing back against the actions of the government at extreme personal risk. So just to be clear to listeners, when I'm talking about Rwanda, I'm talking about the current government, but not the people of Rwanda.
Very clear. Yes, indeed. And thank you again for doing all of this. And we were talking about the aggression. So if this continues,
yeah,
without meaningful consequences,
Yeah,
whether through criminal prosecution or sanctions
yeah,
or political pressure.
yeah.
What does this mean for the future of the UN Charter system and the prohibition of unlawful use of force?
Absolutely, right? It's a great question. And I think I've sort of tried to make this clear to people who don't know as much about Rwanda and DRC, just to explain that this is really a global issue.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because we're seeing this increasing pattern, right, in which states are feeling unconstrained by Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, which is one of the most important articles of the UN Charter, which essentially prohibits the threat or use of force except in self-defense or with the authorization of the UN Security Council, right? We do not want to live in a world in which states can just invade other states because they want to. We want to live in a world in which states are constrained, when maybe states disagree with their neighbors and can take steps to challenge their neighbors, but they're not invading their neighbors. So Rwanda DRC is an example of what happens in a world in which the UN Charter is ignored. And it's certainly not the only example, right? I mean, we're seeing illegal uses of force all across the world. Certainly, the election of Donald Trump in the US has facilitated this and sort of, very much contributed to this trend. But I think the world that I'm scared of and the world in which I fear we're moving into is a world in which powerful states, whether globally powerful or regionally powerful, feel that they can use force whenever they want to achieve political means, right? You want access to certain resources, you want to grow your territory, you don't like your neighbor's government. So rather than negotiating with your neighbor or even suing your neighbor, you invade your neighbor.
Mm.
That's sort of why I've tried to make clear that this is aggression. It's not just a messy, complicated conflict, because fundamentally, part of the reason I'm so concerned about aggression is because it creates cascading
Yeah.
consequences,
A
right?
precedent,
So,
yes.
so you look at Eastern DRC right now, and yes, we have lots of violations committed by Rwanda and M23, but we also just have a lot of fighting between both sides, and fighting results in mass displacement for civilians. Many civilians are getting killed. We've also seen massive counter mobilization, right? So Wazalendo armed groups mobilizing in response to M23. And we see lots of violations committed by Wazalendo as well, right? It's important to note that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that they're not responsible for those violations, but I am saying that part of my concern with aggression is it sets off
Other things,
spirals of violence that are uncontrolled, including violence by other parties. So
yes.
we really want to. This is an important moment for the international community, insofar as it
So
still
act,
exists,
yes.
to stay. We don't accept illegal uses of force. Even if Rwanda has political disagreements with Eastern DRC that are legitimate, and it very well might, there are ways to address this that are not invasion, right? We've had joint Rwanda DRC military operations against against FDLR,
FDR,
sorry,
yes.
multiple times, right? We've had initially in this administration, this Congolese administration, a real effort to build partnerships with regional states.
Yes,
So
economic programs,
yeah,
economic
so there,
signatures that have been made, yes.
exactly. So there are ways states are always going to disagree with each other and have political tensions, and that's reasonable, right? That's understandable. We don't live in a utopia, but the question is what they do in response to those disagreements. And what Rwanda has done is
Mm-hmm.
exactly what we don't want states to do.
Yeah, and you're completely right there, because what stops any other country to invade another
Exactly.
country? So if we
Exactly.
start allowing this globally, we could find ourselves in a very, very, very difficult situation. And
Yeah,
let's not forget that human rights violations are largely being committed in situations of war,
yeah,
women and girls getting raped,
exactly.
mass displacements, uh, young men being drawn into military. It's terrible, and I think it's very urgent that international actors really reflect on this and make sure that this comes to an end as quick as possible before we all find ourselves in a situation that we cannot get out of.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think my fear is that Rwanda will not feel that it needs to leave Eastern DRC, and that we could be in a situation of long-term occupation. And my fear is that long-term occupation can lead to annexation, right? And we see these long, protracted occupations in other parts of the world. The more an occupation continues, the more we start to fear that maybe occupation is going to turn into annexation. And I think we have a lot of reasons to fear that in the Eastern DRC context, because M23 and the areas under its control, I should say M23 and Rwanda, have not tried to keep things as they were, right? They've put in new governing officials, they put in new judicial systems, they've destroyed land records, property records, they've redistributed land, they've engaged in mass recruitment. So fundamentally, we're looking at a transformation of Eastern DRC. And I don't know whether the objective is to ever officially annex Eastern DRC into Rwanda. I sort of doubt that. But my fear is that we could have a long-term kind of M23 state. There was kind of a Rwandan proxy state.
Rwanda state,
Yeah,
basically.
or or that M23 could, that we could have a Kivu state, something like that. So I think there are a lot of scary possibilities, and I mean, you see those, we know those possibilities exist because we see them in so many other parts of the world.
Mm-hmm. So, moving towards the end of our conversation, because we don't have time on our side, they are individuals who either in the region or in the diaspora publicly express support for the M23 armed group, and who sometimes financially or through advocacy also support that group. From an international law perspective, could certain forms of support for an armed group like M23 that is committing war crimes expose individuals to criminal liability in your view?
It's a great question, and just to be clear, it's really context dependent, right? It depends what kind of support, and then in the country in which that takes place. So first of
Mm-hmm.
all, I think one thing that's important to note is it may actually expose them to domestic criminal accountability, right? So if you are in a state in which M23 is sanctioned, right, and
Mm-hmm.
there are many states around the world that have sanctions against M23, and you are providing financial support to M23, you may be violating your state's sanctions laws, and that could expose you to civil or criminal liability. So I think even beyond questions of the ICC and international law, I think we need to understand that if I am violating sanctions law by supporting a sanctioned group financially, I may expose myself to individual criminal liability. So I would, I think that's something that people should be aware of, very much aware of. Secondly, it's true that, the ICC has an investigation in Eastern DRC.
Mm-hmm.
Given the jurisdictional limits I mentioned, we're not going to see arrest warrants by the ICC for aggression, but we could see them for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And depending, or theoretically, genocide, although I think that's less likely. So theoretically, the level of support, if you are providing a certain level of support to crimes,
Mm-hmm.
you could theoretically fall within the jurisdiction of a court, perhaps by aiding and abetting a particular crime. It's quite the reason I'm being a little bit vague is because it's so context dependent, right? It really depends on the amount of support, the way in which that support relates to particular crimes. But I think what I would say at the broadest level is if you are providing support, financial support in particular, to M23 today, um, you are exposing yourself potentially to liability at different levels,
Yes.
criminal, civil, domestic, and international. To put it bluntly, it's really not a good idea.
Not a
Uh,
good idea. Yes.
and I think that listeners should understand, regardless of your politics, that you are entering into a dangerous legal zone if you are providing support to a group that is widely sanctioned, like M23 is.
Yes, thank you so much for highlighting this, because I think it's important for these supporters of armed groups that commit crimes against humanity to understand the consequences that this support can come with. So it's
Yeah.
very dangerous, and also on a moral stand ground, you should not do that as a human being to other
Absolutely.
people. Very
Absolutely.
simple.
But I think it's an interesting thing for human rights organizations to explore is, if you're aware of people providing support to M23, there are potential steps that you can take. People should not, it's my personal view that
Mine too,
support to
yes.
M23, is something that uh, is not something that I agree with you is ethically acceptable. And I would again warn people against it from a legal perspective.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you.
Last but not least, what would your message be to our audience? What should they remember from this conversation?
I appreciate it. I mean, I think maybe I'll say a few things very quickly. First, I think it's really important to understand from a legal perspective that's what's happening in Rwanda and DRC is not something that is incomprehensible. It is an act of aggression by one state against another state.
Mm-hmm.
It's obviously much more complicated than that, but we have a core violation of the international legal order. Rwanda used force against Eastern DRC with no self-defense, plausible self-defense argument, right? From this core violation, we've seen lots and lots and lots of other violations, but we need to understand this core violation of the international legal order and what it means. Secondly, we should not give up and accept the fact that Rwanda's aggression and occupation are, you know, will inevitably continue. We need to keep up the pressure, and the Rwandan government needs to understand that states and international institutions and civil society organizations aren't going to sit quietly by as it continues to strengthen its hold over big parts of North and South Kivu. So those are two messages that I would send.
Yeah, thank you so much, Daniel. And with that powerful message, we have come to the end of today's conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone who tuned in today. And a heartfelt thank you again for our incredible guest, Daniel Levine-Spound, for his amazing contribution to today's conversation, mainly regarding the Rwandan aggression towards the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And as I say in Kinyarwanda, Imana ifasha uwifashije. God helps those who help themselves. Let that be a call for all of us. If you believe in democracy, human dignity, and the rule of law, now is not the time to look away. We must reject complicity through silence. We must raise our voices and stand in solidarity with those who can speak freely. Until next time, take care and stay engaged.
Thank you.